Welcome everyone to my introduction to Kant's first critique and what I see as the project of the first critique. I'm going to be reading from an excerpt of one of my lectures on Kant. And if you'd like to study Kant's critiques more intensely with me, then please follow the link in the description of this video. So, on dogmatic slumbers and the project of the first critique, here's a quote from Kant. Human reason has the peculiar fate in one species of its cognitions that it is burdened with questions which it cannot dismiss, since they are given to it as problems by the nature of reason itself, but which it also cannot answer, since they transcend every capacity of human reason. Thus begins the preface of the first edition of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, which to this day depicts an earthquake to thought and its self-understanding. The, quote, unavoidable problems of pure reason itself are God, freedom, and immortality, tells us Kant, which metaphysics had only dogmatically addressed, he believes. Which question, though, was most fundamental to thought, so fundamental that it had not been rendered explicit, or at least it had been in some sense forgotten for millennia, until Hume awoke Kant from his dogmatic slumbers. What were those dogmatic slumbers? The fundamental yet somewhat concealed theme of philosophy had been and is, of course, the unity of being and thought. This unity collapses with Hume's skepticism. Or at least this unity in its collapse also becomes explicit and is at once pulled into radical doubt, and thus the crisis of thinking sets in, a crisis which we today still suffer through. If indeed the unity of being and thought is at the heart of European thinking, their falling apart requires attempt at reconciliation between being and thought, yes, but also between man and nature by extension, between the human being and the world. This falling apart is owed to Hume's radical skepticism, no less, a skepticism it is much more destructive in an ontological sense than any Cartesian methodological doubt was. The split between being and thought, which translates also into the split between man and nature, announces itself, of course, with Descartes, but it fulfills itself fully with Hume. The world one sees today could be an entirely different one tomorrow, according to Hume. So we cannot form genuine cognition about an object, according to Hume. It is simply a matter of habit that we assume that the sun will rise tomorrow again. Hence the world is under threat of becoming a subjectivistic fiction, and the much bemoaned subject-object dichotomy, a term which Karl Jaspers coined, which fulfills itself, we could say, further in the digitization of the world and the reduction of human being to the brain. The much bemoaned subject-object dichotomy shows its force. How, though, to speak with the ancients, could appearances be saved in a post-Humean world? Plato and Aristotle were deeply concerned with the question how to save and how to safeguard the phenomena, so to say, phenomena. Are appearances mere subjectivistic fiction, at the mercy of the whims of the human subject, which in turn is only a heap of impressions, according to Hume? Whence the power of this subject? Still, this radical doubt of Hume brings to the fore, at least to some degree, the implicit presupposition of thought articulated explicitly by Parmenides, which is the union of being and thinking. Perhaps it is not too much of an exaggeration to claim all of modern metaphysics before Kant had been dogmatically sleepwalking in this presupposition of all thought. What Hume certainly brings to the fore is the despotic actions of pure reason and its dogmatic legislations. For metaphysics, once, quote, the queen of all the sciences, had become a battlefield of endless controversies, says Kant. For reason had begun to disregard appearances, or disregard the experiential. Reason, says Kant, cannot even discover, quote, the ground of its hidden errors. For, quote, the principles on which it is proceeding, since they surpass the bounds of all experience, no longer recognize any touchstone of experience, end of quote. This result is not arbitrary, but owed again to the presupposition of thought, which had not been called into question, and which in early modernity, perhaps for the prevalence of the Latin and French vernaculars, led to formalization processes of the world for the sake of control. Of course, one needs to be careful here and avoid allegations as though Kant had set out to articulate knowledge for the sake of control. Rather, Kant attempts what philosophy has always attempted, to save the appearances against both dogmatic slumbers and the nihilistic attacks of the sophists. Not unlike Socrates, Plato's and Aristotle's project, attempting to defend Sophia against the onslaught of the sophists. The threat of skepticism is not a benign one, but attacks the human being and the relationship of the human being with the world, with appearances at the core of this relationship, and also attacks human freedom. So Kant's battle is also really a battle for human freedom. Dogmatic metaphysics for Kant means the Wolffian Leibnizian Schulmetaphysik, the school metaphysics, or the metaphysics of the schoolmasters, that granted concepts such as essence, possibility, and identity to be applied to things of the mind, without sensory judgment or experiential content. Metaphysics becomes a battlefield precisely because in purely rationalist and formal logic terms, the metaphysical systems of Leibniz and Wolff, for example, hold up and are coherent within themselves, yes, but they are also not tied to experience, to empiria. They are hence at odds with each other. They compete with each other, obstructing the I, the ego, from accessing the world in a sense. What dogmatic metaphysics wants to establish is the unconditioned necessary grounds. Yet Kant begins to see also something else that is crucial. In the first critique, he writes, the unconditioned necessity which we need so indispensably as the ultimate sustainer of all things is for human reason the true abyss. And against this abyss, human reason, affected by questions it cannot possibly hope to answer, erects illusory dogmatic systems which Kant sets out to destruct and critique. So note that not only is reason affected by certain questions. As mentioned, the fundamental theme of philosophy is and has been and is the unity of thought and being, a unity which only collapses with Hume. The tradition of what is now called Transcendental Idealism could also be summarized as the attempt to establish again this union. Martin Heidegger, in his last lecture course Was heißt Denken, what calls for thinking, or what is called thinking, also attempted to articulate again in a non-dogmatic but also non-dialectical sense the belonging together of thinking and being out of and through their difference. Now, in terms of Kant and his critique of dogmatics and skeptics, thanks to both of them, the skeptics and the dogmatics, Kant sees precisely this presupposition at work in thought, the unity of being and thought. He sees it clearly and knows therefore that he must establish the validity and possibility of this synthetic a priori judgment of the unity of being and thought again, if he indeed wishes to establish a metaphysics as a science, which is what he sets out to do. So the critiques don't write this metaphysics, but they provide the basis for it. And arguably, Hegel's Science of Logic is the continuation of the transcendental logical project, and also is the achievement of the sublation of the aporias that are still present in Kant. And of course, what is usually pointed out is that Kant unifies empiricism and rationalism. But I would suggest that this is perhaps not entirely the case. He doesn't unify rationalism and empiricism. He doesn't try to unify the mind first and the position of rationalism, which means that the mind comes first, or empiricism, which means that the empirical, the experiential comes first. Instead, I would suggest that he refutes both of them and brings about something much more radically different, which is transcendental idealism. By the way, empiricism, just as a side note, will always end in dogmatic skepticism, for all empiricism can do is run after experience. So at some point, Hume ultimately has, for all times, shown us where empiricism leads. It leads into such a radical skepticism as he proposes. Why? Because there's always a running after, a lapsing after experience, which it cannot hope to unify. So Kant does not try to combine rationalism and empiricism, which is the ordinary story that usually people are being taught at university, but instead transcendental idealism is an entirely different project altogether. It is a system of necessary positings such that the collapse of the union of being and thought is no longer possible, so that the unity of thought and being can no longer be attacked by the skeptic. And at the same time, this also wards off, transcendental idealism that is, rationalistic slumbers, and enables authoritative cognitions and judgments about the world, but a priori. So we're not really looking at the experiential content, we're looking at the a priori necessary conditions for any such experience that is repeatable and replicable, so that enables scientific replicability. In some sense, Kant is the philosopher of science then. So furthermore, while the dogmatic metaphysical systems of thought are coherent within themselves, they inevitably lead to contradictions once confronted with spatio-temporal experience. Why? Because they receive their meaning independently of, that is to say, not with a view to spatio-temporal intuition. Hence, what Kant refers to as his Copernican turn becomes necessary. And we will discuss the Copernican turn, etc., in more detail at my Kant course. The link to enroll is in the description of this video. Kant's Copernican turn, however, does not mark some benign new approach to epistemology. Again, usually the first critique is presented as an epistemology, but Kant's first critique really is not an epistemology. For the first, it is a logic, and explicitly so. What it addresses is the form of thought itself, and it also revolutionizes the form of thought. That is why the first critique is such an earthquake. For the first time here in what is called transcendental idealism, that's an idealism that posits the necessary conditions a priori for the unity of objects and consciousness, the qualities of objects or things as they are in themselves matters not. Transcendental means precisely this: necessary a priori conditions before experience, but for experience. So, before all experience, the pure forms of intuition, space and time, together with the categories, the concept of the understanding, establish the very objectivity of objects. The objectivity of objects, not the objects themselves, but the objectivity of objects. So not the objects themselves, but the formal objectivity which allows to form the objects from the manifold of appearances, which are only subsequently formed from representations of appearances. Yeah? Hence, it should become apparent that Kant does not provide an epistemology, but a system of principled positings, necessary also precisely because the unity of thought and being had collapsed, which is the crisis of modernity. And you can find here on my channel a lecture of mine on Kant and the meta crisis. I will link to it in somewhere up here. This is more fundamental than the benign questions: how do we form knowledge? How do I know what I know? Which are, simply put, the questions of epistemology. Epistemology is, you can draw an epistemology out of Kant's critiques, but really what is at stake is the form of thought itself. The guiding motif here for Kant is the insight into the need for securing all necessary conditions prior to forming any cognition, prior even to, of course, any experience. The first critique, the critique of pure reason, tries to justify exactly this in order to respond to one question. What do subjective forms of thinking have to do with objectivity? But even more radically, for Kant, and this is the Copernican turn in a nutshell, objects are now to adhere to the human mind, its concepts and categories. The I becomes central, the center. The I becomes the sun around which the world revolves. The finite, logical, non-personal, and non-psychological I, very important to understand that this is not a personal I and not a psychological I, not an existential I, but a finite, logical I, a principle I that becomes here a philosophical principle that stands outside the world, and it is the logical universalism of the I that enables the victory march of the European natural and mathematical sciences that we've seen over the past centuries. Richard Kroner, who has written one of the greatest commentaries on German idealism, which I can highly recommend, from Kant bis Hegel, from Kant to Hegel. Now, according to Kroner, the achievement of Kant in German idealism more broadly is the shift of idealism from the outer to the inner. The self, the Gemüt, becomes the locus of the ideal. No longer are ideas the primordial images primarily constitutive of world access and appearances. Now human consciousness, which of course, even in Plato we could say there's a certain innerness because there's anamnesis in play, but here with Kant really fully, human consciousness of ideas is the highest authority. The notion of Innerlichkeit, of innerness, which yes, sometimes can be translated as subjectivity, interiority, or inwardness, will be crucial for the trajectory of German idealism, but also for German romanticism, and also, of course, the lapsing of German romanticism into a crude subjectivism. That's always a threat. Also, at this time, is that this thought movement could just lapse into a crass solipsism, almost, we could say, or at least a subjectivism which doesn't need to be solipsistic, but which can also denigrate the world, to put it simply. So, however, this goes together, perhaps we should point out briefly, with ethical life, etc., and especially for Kant, the ethical dimension is crucial. The first critique is really building up to the second critique, the critique of practical reason. The revolution, overturning of world metaphysics is what Kant's first critique is after. One of the results is, to borrow a remark from Professor Max Gottschlich, the following: if you're able to get on an airplane, a bus, or drive a car without breaking out in fear and trembling, then you are a firm believer in transcendental idealism. Why? Because it is thanks to the system of principal positings of transcendental idealism that the human mind can determine, prior to but already a priori related to any experience, that gasoline will always react in the same way under a certain set of predetermined conditions. The discoveries of the modern mathematical sciences, including physics, helped pave the way for a move away from the Platonic world of ideas towards the transcendental sphere. The transcendental logic developed by Kant does not look for substances or metaphysical forces. While this thinking is not based on mathematical relationships, it was the pure thought of modern mathematics that accustomed thinking to this higher level of abstraction. The transcendental sphere no longer regards active substances, but understands the realm of thinking as a system of positings of the I. So again, it's a system of positings, of suppositions brought forth by the I. Thus, Kant's system is a return, to a certain degree, to an idealism, but on a different level. It's now one that is not really a metaphysical one, but a transcendental one. A transcendental one where the regulative ideas are posited such that the objectivity of experience becomes possible and hence also necessary. And so with this, I release you and invite you to read Kant's first critique as a transcendental logic, a revolution of the form of thought itself, which is perhaps also how we should understand, of course, the Copernican turn. And if you're ready to step deeper into Kant's system, into his critical battlefield, the battle for freedom, no less also, then I'd like to invite you to join my Kant course. The link to enroll is in the description of this video. And if you know anyone who's interested in Kant, German idealism more broadly, or any post-Kantian philosophy, which again would not be possible without Kant, then please share this video with them and perhaps also my Kant course. Thank you very much indeed.